Our next guest says America's media needs a total transformation. Matt Taibbi, a progressive journalist who is a New York Times best-selling author and columnist for Rolling Stone, writes, "The flaw in the system is that even the biggest news companies now operate under the assumption that at least half their potential audience isn't listening. This leads to all sorts of problems on all sides. We now lean into inflammatory caricatures because the financial incentives encourage it." Matt, welcome to News Nation. It is a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's start with your assessment of the state of the media today. What do you see as the biggest problem?
Well, I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Hate Inc. that was about the transformation of really the commercial model of media in this country. And the central idea there is that we went from a model that was standard in the 80s and the 70s, where there were just 3 networks, where it was normal for a news company to go for the entire audience. You were building a newscast that was designed to be consumed by the entire family, whether it was your right-wing uncle or the teenage kid in the Che t-shirt. But with the advent of the internet and cable, the landscape became very atomized and fragmented, and now the news strategy stresses picking a demographic and trying to dominate it by feeding it news that you know that they will like. So the message went from being something that was broad and designed to be consumed by everybody to being something that was highly charged and designed to animate a smaller demographic. And usually what that involves is giving them lots of content that's provocative about some other group.
Or reinforces their own views.
Exactly, yes. No, that's actually a crucial element of the commercial strategy is, once you build up a relationship with your audience and they start to have some expectations about what kind of content they're going to get, you really can't disrupt their expectations. It's almost like a continuity error in film where people begin to expect a certain thing, and if you give them a truth that may well be accurate but is not part of a narrative that they're accepting, they will go to another station. And people are afraid of this, and that's why we very seldom challenge our audiences anymore.
And you have said as media becomes more politicized, the value of traditionally independent media lifers has decreased. That's sad to say. Gone are the days of old, and if that's true, and I hope that it's not, at least moving forward, where is the nearest exit, so to speak, for us in the media? And in your opinion, can we get back to a road of trust between the public and the press and politicians?
Yeah, it's a really tough question because I think we need to innovate and find some ways to create new products or ventures that will have different strategies for attracting audiences. The current setup, I think even people who consume channels like Fox News or MSNBC on the other side, even if they enjoy that programming, on some level they probably understand they're being pandered to or being fed political news that is all in one direction. And so subconsciously they will lose an element of trust in those news sources. I think the problem is we have to find a way to train audiences to be a little bit disappointed in the news sometimes or bored by it, and to turn it on and not have expectations that you might have for an entertainment program, for instance. And that might take a while.
Well, you created a really good segue for me, Matt, to talk about News Nation, because according to recent surveys, an increasing number of Americans have lost faith in the media, and that really resonates with us here at News Nation. As I was expressing to you, we launched a few months ago with a mission of being unbiased, just the facts, down the middle, giving a place that people can go to hear both sides of the events of the day. Do you believe that there is a hunger for this? It's certainly not as sexy as what we're seeing on TV, but is there a need for objectivity, and do people want it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny because in my own career, I'm exactly not that guy. If you actually look at my work, I'm a product of the period when the new journalists came along, Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson that was highly opinionated and highly colorful and was not that anodyne, just the facts down the middle kind of presentation. However, I hear even from my own audiences that I'm desperate to find some place where I can go just to get the basics of what happened on X, Y, or Z event without being editorialized to all the time. And just to take an example, with the events of at the Capitol last week, if you turned on one channel, you were going to get news that this was the worst thing since Pearl Harbor, and if you turned on another channel, they were basically telling you that this was something on the order of a fraternity prank that were like the plot of the movie Airheads or something like that, and people didn't trust either interpretation of events. They wanted to hear the whole picture. How bad was it exactly? Like don't give us the highly politicized, highly charged version of your interpretation. Just tell us what you know, and that's what's missing from the current commercial landscape.
You talk about January 6th. We all watched, and many of us reported on what happened at the U.S. Capitol as it came under attack. You say the media did play a role in what happened that day. What I'm hearing you say is our words matter, and the ones that we choose resonate with people at home. What do you think could have been done differently that day to reach more people in a fair and responsible way?
Well, it's not so much what happened that day, it's what's happened for the entire period leading up to that day. The historian Christopher Lasch once upon a time said that propaganda is about creating a constant sense of crisis, and Americans have been in this mindset for really the better part of a half decade now, that every day is an event on the order of the Watergate or the moon landing. Like we're in a constant state of breaking massive news that has heightened our anxiety levels about everything from, whether it was the 2020 election or COVID or whatever it is. And so we tend to have incredibly emotional responses to news, and we don't also have outlets that are incentivized to mitigate those responses. Nobody is telling us to calm down and have a cooler head and let's look at this in perspective. We're always being incited to take the maximalist interpretation of things, and so it doesn't matter what audience we're talking about. Clearly, with Trump's audience, he was saying some things that led them to believe that this whole thing was coming down to one day where they had to, they either won that day or they were going to lose forever, and that's not really what life is like. There really always is a tomorrow, and we have to communicate that to audiences to keep them calm. I guess that's an inarticulate way of saying we've just amped up anxiety levels generally so high that events like that are inevitable.
And I often believe, very strongly in fact, that our job as journalists is to truly listen. And I think many of us, it's easy to get away from that. And I think just as human beings, the most important thing we can do for someone else is to truly listen to them. You often get heat from fellow progressives about your willingness to engage with people who think differently than you. I actually love that, including conservatives. So why is that dialogue so important?
Well, I think it's important just generally as a journalistic technique, and this is a generational thing that's also been a big change in our business. A couple of years ago, I saw a columnist write something amazing. I forget what outlet it was for, but he was basically saying, I hate the telephone. He doesn't like to talk to people before he writes. And I grew up in an era when constant dialogue was actually the entire job. Like you had to be on the phone all the time. And the reason for that is that if you go into a story with preconceptions, you're almost guaranteed to get it wrong every single time. And you can't base your work on what you did yesterday either. You have to do each new event with a clean slate. And that means listening to people anew every time you get an assignment or every time you cover anything. And it doesn't matter what you're talking about, whether you're talking about the election in 2020, or the lockdown policies, or who's right about whether masks work or not. I mean, I have definite opinions about that fall in line with what everybody tells me, but I do think it's important to listen to other points of view, because not so infrequently, people who we think are wrong turn out to be right, or at least partially right. So it's important to listen, and it's also important to listen to criticism. I think that's a crucial element of doing the reporting job correctly.
Yeah, and continuing to learn from one another. You've been critical of President Trump, but you've also given him credit when you thought credit was due and he deserved it. What do you think his legacy will be?
Well, I think it's going to be incredibly negative. He is going to be remembered for a time period that was, basically wall-to-wall discord. I covered Trump's campaign in 2015, 2016, and I remember very graphically that he made a great deal of promises to his audience about correcting long-standing failures of the bipartisan political system. And I don't think he did a whole lot that you could say addressed those promises. In addition, this last chapter of his presidency with the election result controversy, I think it's pretty difficult to argue that he didn't carry it on too far, and he's going to be remembered as an infamous character because of that. I think in many of the same ways that Nixon was dogged by Watergate. I just don't think that he's going to be separated from that legacy by historians.
What do you make of the relationship between President Trump and the press over the past 4 years?
I wrote once that Trump was a very difficult character to explain, because he's simultaneously one of the biggest liars we've had in politics, but also the most lied about politician that we've had probably in recent memory. There was a decision that the press made early on in his tenure, and I remember listening to conversations about this among people in the press corps that were people who were covering him, that we had to take a sharper tone towards Trump. There was a very influential editorial called "Trump is Testing the Norms of Objectivity in Journalism" that was written in the New York Times in 2016, that essentially said that journalists had to be not just true, but true to history's judgment. And what that really meant was taking a more openly politicized posture toward the incoming president. So there was a stress on not normalizing Trump, which to a lot of journalists meant different things, but to me, the central feature of that was that a slow news day was considered a betrayal of the news mission, because Trump was so bad that there couldn't possibly be such a thing as a normal news day. So there always had to be an emergency, and we careened from one moral mania to the other. And a lot of those stories were exaggerated or later fell apart, and they were always slanted in one direction. And I think that's one of the reasons why Trump's audience is so radicalized. They feel like they've been given an unfair shake by the traditional media, and there is some justice in what they think.
Well, wasn't it Seinfeld that said it's not a lie if you believe it?
Right.
Do you think that the media has covered President Trump fairly?
I would say no. I understand what they're doing, and I understand that there are a lot of people who believe that Trump is a singular, unique threat, and therefore we have to maintain a maximally aggressive posture towards him. And that's a lot of people who are very close friends of mine and colleagues for a long time believe that. But I believe that ultimately, if we print things that aren't true, that it always bounces back on the media, and that it's safer just to call things exactly as we see them, rather than try to lean into narratives whether they fit or not. Just to take an example, there was a universal consensus that there was no interference by the FBI in the FISA warrant application process involving former Trump aide Carter Page. People were denounced for saying that there was. The Congressman Devin Nunes was ridiculed. There were calls to have him removed from Congress for even suggesting such a thing. And then it turned out in an Inspector General's report a year later that he was exactly right. And there was no effort by the news media to go back and say, you know what, we got that wrong. All those editorials we wrote, they were wrong. And, blue state audiences didn't pay a whole lot of attention to that, but red state audiences for sure did. And there were lots and lots of examples of stories like that. And that undercuts our credibility. Every time we do something like that, it makes us less influential and takes away our institutional authority, which is what we should be trying to protect all the time.
Chips away at our responsibility and really the mission that we all set out when we begin this career in journalism. Because I asked you if the press treated President Trump fairly in an effort to balance that, do you think the press has treated Joe Biden fairly? And what is our responsibility in that effort moving forward?
I think Biden has not had a particularly aggressive treatment by the news media yet. It's odd, when he ran for president in 1988, the press basically sank his campaign, and over a plagiarism scandal in 2008, which I also covered, he was essentially bounced out again by the news media. He got a tremendous amount of negative attention. This time, it was odd from the beginning. A lot of the press treatments of him actually underplayed his chances of winning the nomination because they didn't believe that he would keep his lead, and his persistent levels of support was actually one of the most underplayed stories early in the Democratic primary race. But I would say that since he became the nominee, he's gotten every favor from most of the people in the news media, and there have been some significant developments. The decision by Facebook and Twitter to squelch the New York Post expose, which, I don't necessarily think was all that important a story, but the story about Hunter Biden's emails being essentially wiped off the internet by a couple of big platforms, that is an indication of a major institutional effort to protect this politician, which is concerning, and something we have to keep an eye on going forward.
What's the fix? What is our mission together as journalists to get this right?
Well, I think we're in a place now intellectually where a lot of people who come into the media believe that the goal of journalism is to advance this or that political cause with our reporting. And so we look for stories that we think are going to help, or we propagandize this or that politician versus another one, or we stress stories that we think are going to help one party or over another. I think we might want to consider at least trying to go back to another version of what the press's mission is supposed to be, which is, we just try to get things as accurate as possible, and that allows the audiences to be better informed, and then they make the political decisions, that are important. The current view of the press from within the press is that we want to guide you towards a decision through our reporting. Whereas the old view, from people, my father's generation, he was also a reporter, was let's just tell you what we know and then you figure it out, because just getting it right is actually a very, very difficult job. Once you start trying to put your thumb on the scale, it complicates this mission, and I think it's too much for us to handle to try to get that right.
Yeah, the lines have certainly blurred. I will agree with you there. When you talk about radicals on either side of the political fence, Republicans and Democrats, they are everywhere. But in that, do we lose the larger voice of the American public, people out there who do have thoughts, who are investigating their facts, who want the truth, and who want responsible journalism? Are we hearing from them, or are their voices getting lost in all this noise?
I do think. I think their voices are getting lost again because we've got a divided system of media that caters towards conflict and is aimed particularly at an audience that is already sort of predisposed to be upset about something. We are from the start deciding not to create content for a vast kind of in-between audience of people who may be less political in their orientation, or who may be interested in the news for some other reason. And that audience is, I think, being ignored, and it's one of the reasons why we see the proliferation of such successful independent genres. I mean, just to take an example, the Joe Rogan Experience, which is a podcast, its audience is significantly larger than the biggest cable news audiences. And the reason for that is that, it kind of looks in all directions. It has a non-judgmental approach to the people who are interviewed, and that's absent in today's media. So yes, I think you're right. I think if there were to be a different product, that it would reach a large audience that's currently not being tended to.
And just to kind of wrap things up, just two more questions for you, Matt. When you look at recent surveys and you hear about the increasing number of Americans who have lost faith in what we do, I think it should energize us to get it right going forward. When you talk about objectivity, what is most critical in a mission of objectivity and delivering on that promise to our audience from both sides? And I'm saying this selfishly because it is our mission here at NewsNation.
Yeah, that's great. So for me, objectivity, I always believed what people like Hunter Thompson and Tom Wolfe believed, which is that objectivity is basically an unattainable quality, like that no matter how hard you try to be fair and down the middle, you will always eventually reveal your feelings about things. How big do you make the headline? What page do you put the story on? How high do you put up this quote versus another? You're always revealing yourself. People are always revealing themselves when they communicate. However, as an aspirational goal, objectivity, I think, is useful. And the idea of trying to be as fair as possible and to cut things down, maybe not the middle, but at least to attempt to hear all points of view before you commit to doing a story. That's a really important aspirational goal for the media. We should try to be fair at all times, and we're just not incentivized commercially to do that right now, which is what's worrying to me.
Walter Cronkite, Matt, was, as you know, a newsman in a much, much different time. But I do think a lot of what he said and how he operated as a journalist is important in today's media landscape. And I read his book often. In fact, I have it in my desk here at work. And when asked what he really thought of President Richard Nixon at that time in our nation's history, Cronkite gave his standard answer about not rendering personal opinions on figures in the news. Are you optimistic that the media landscape right now, when our nation is so polarized, can get back to a place such as that?
That's a great point. And, it's important to point out that Walter Cronkite, in 2 different decades, was voted overwhelmingly the most trusted person in the United States. I think it was both in 1973 and in 1985 that he won those honors. And the reason for that is exactly what you were talking about. He had as a policy, trying to keep his personal predilections hidden as much as possible from the audience. And that wasn't about being coy. It was about doing the job first. And that's unfortunately not really possible in today's media, where every reporter has a social media presence. They're telling you what they think, not only about politics, but about entertainment shows and whether they have dogs or cats at home. I mean, you know everybody. They're public figures. But the anonymity of journalists once upon a time was an important protective mechanism for the reporter, because It allowed that person to safely report in all directions without outraging a particular audience. But B, it also added credibility to what that person was doing because audiences couldn't tell whether the reporting was informed by, some political predilection or not. And we've lost that. Now there's no such thing as a newsreader whose personal opinions are a mystery to us. And I think it is kind of important to try to see if that model still has some staying power, because I think it would.
A lot more challenging in the 24-hour news cycle and the advent of the internet. But Matt, I do agree. I'm hopeful about our future as journalists. I think we can both agree as well that our responsibility is maybe never greater than it is right now. So thank you for, one, listening, for talking to people who have differing opinions than yours, and for your good questions. I think we can all strive to be useful idiots at this time.
All right. Thank you, Marnie. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. And make sure to join us for News Nation anytime.
Absolutely. Take care now.
You too.